I have enjoyed Ace Team's Clash Universe games every time I've decided to play one. They're mechanically engaging, and the worlds are always wonderfully realized and completely unique. Something I find particularly impressive about the first Xenoclash game is how much style and personality it contains, especially considering that it was Ace Team's first commercially released game. The people over at Atlus were also impressed with Ace Team, and the two organizations struck up a partnership that saw Atlus publish the next 5 games Ace Team would go on to develop, including Xenoclash 2, and arguably the studio's most famous series, Rock of Ages. First released in 2011, the Rock of Ages games feature a fascinating combination of racing and tower defense that is unlike anything I've come across before. But despite being so unusual, the games are also deceptively simple in a way that makes them very approachable. There aren't many games that play like Rock of Ages, but within a few minutes, everyone will know how to play Rock of Ages. The campaigns are set up like a series of one-on-one versus matches, where the player must defeat whoever their opponent is by squashing them with a boulder. They're standing in a castle at the bottom of an obstacle course that the boulder has to navigate down in order to do the crushing. At the same time, Sisyphus, or Atlas, is standing in a very similar castle at the bottom of a very similar track, and the opposing player will be sending boulders down to knock at their castle doors. Each boulder must be slowly chiseled from a block, and while the player waits for their ammo to be ready, they can place defenses on their side of the track to slow and potentially destroy the enemy boulder if they can deal enough damage. A lot of the game revolves around the simulated physics of the boulder, which can take a little while to get used to. Pressing the movement keys adds directional velocity to the boulder, so it's best to start turning early to avoid flying off the track, while slowing down is best done by smashing into whatever obstacles are nearby. Also, the size and speed of the rock colliding with the castle door determines how much damage it deals, so dodging traps and maintaining speed are necessary for a good hit. Destroying the enemy stuff earns the player money to use on their own defenses, which are unlocked frequently throughout each campaign. These can vary from simple stone walls to some proper Ace Team oddities, like this hot air balloon that dangles a lion beneath it, or this vacuum suction whale that can capture and toss boulders off the level. There are also alternative boulders to unlock, as well as a handful of boss fights scattered throughout the campaigns. In order to ground what could easily be a very alien experience, Ace Team made the decision to theme the games with European and North African art and history. In the first game, the player controls Sisyphus after he uses his boulder to escape Hades' torment. Sisyphus and the boulder then bounce around Europe, getting into fights with Napoleon and Da Vinci and David, while giving as much Monty Python as they could legally get away with. The paintings are chopped and puppeteered, with mumbling used to voice all of the characters, and plenty of references to get the people hyped.
You shall not pass!
When the gameplay starts, everything goes right back to Ace Team's bread and butter, with hidden faces plastered over surprisingly high-quality models. There's a strange dichotomy between the building and rolling phases in the first game that I think stems from a lack of particle effects in the scene. From above, the maps almost look like toys. They're colourful, but they're also kind of sterile and plain. But then all of those issues go away once the player takes control of the boulder and can see the fabulous skyboxes. The first couple of levels use this ancient Greek black figure pottery art style, which is then bathed by the setting sun, adding a lot of richness to the terracotta-coloured terrain. Then, as the adventure leads towards Central Europe, the style shifts to medieval painting set against a grassy mountainside, while solar diagrams fill the sky. Some of the later environments remind me of Lair, a game defined by its massive, barren battlefields, which is an unfortunate comparison. But things get better as Sisyphus travels west, and the game's presentation as a whole leaps in quality when the second game tries to emulate expressionist painters Edvard Munch and Vincent van Gogh. Rock of Ages 2 also has significantly improved particle effects, and a much better looking building mode that makes placing all of the sequel's new toys a more visually pleasing experience. The player can't just place whatever they want anywhere on the track. There are specified building tiles that can only ever be occupied once each match. If you build a big wall across the entire lane, and the enemy knocks it over, it isn't possible to directly repair the wall. You have to try something else. Like maybe the wall is 2 tiles behind where it used to be. Placing objects costs the player some amount of gold, which is earned either by destroying stuff as the boulder, or by placing mines wherever possible. In the first game, the mine can be placed anywhere, with its effectiveness based on the number of unoccupied buildable tiles around the mine, while the sequel added specific mine shaft locations that the structure must be placed beside. Since these mines are a consistent source of gold income, most players might feel incentivized to place defenses around them. The CPU certainly agrees, and will fortify their mines. But I noticed the enemy boulder will never detour to try and destroy a player's mine, even if it's on the way to the castle at the bottom. Actually, a lot of what the CPU boulder does seems illogical and self-destructive. It'll often get stuck in loops where it repeatedly falls off the track, or loses all momentum between a couple of walls and just stops moving entirely. If nothing comes along and destroys the boulder, the CPU will just sit in place indefinitely and give you a free win. This can get especially bad on the tracks that are more disconnected islands than a single continuous lane. I found it easy to set up the conditions that'll stop the enemy from being able to fight back when there was no safety barrier for it. These levels are fun to platform down, but they don't really offer much challenge. There are 7 structures available in the first game that range from simple towers and piles of explosives, to charging cattle, and Da Vinci's aerial screw that can call in off-screen airstrikes onto the enemy boulder. This range is substantial enough to carry the campaign's 4-hour runtime, and I was impressed by how Ace Team managed to add even more variety for the sequel. Rock of Ages 2 is definitely more of the same, but that bigger and bolder tagline is the truth. There are more encounters, a wider range of track layouts, and a significantly larger retinue of options for the player to explore. Unfortunately, all of this new stuff only added an extra hour to my playthrough, even when playing on the hardest difficulty. I did prefer the new overworld design, and the change from keys placed in the level to stars earned by beating both the tower defense and obstacle course versions of each encounter. The player can now choose which encounter they want to tackle first, with the knowledge of which obstacle unlock is waiting beyond. There's also a new buying phase at the beginning of an encounter, where the player can choose which boulder shape they want, as well as the arsenal of units they'll have available. It took a while for me to find a boulder shape I preferred over the default, and as much as I wanted the cube to work, it rolls like a cube. It also takes a long time to carve, which I don't really understand, but whatever. Maybe it takes a while to magically awaken the face in the marble. The new tracks are prettier and more colourful than before, and there are more complex track layouts too. But there's a lot more flat and uphill sections that I find to be kind of out of place in a game like this. As good looking as Van Gogh's level is, it has no real gradient at all, so the gameplay doesn't read like a rock being pushed down a hill. At the same time, however, the willingness to skirt around requiring a sloped track meant that Ace Team could be more creative with their non-standard encounters, and we'd likely never be able to play foosball against God to decide if Atlas has to carry the world on his back or not. Both games feature a handful of boss encounters that shift the primary dynamics of the game away from boulders rolling down hills to using the boulder as like a typical 3D platformer protagonist. This starts in Slovenia, when a dragon shows up, and the boulder has to bump against its chest while Sisyphus cheers from atop a nearby megalith. The dragon has one real attack, where it sweeps the ground in front of it and then blasts fire in a forward cone. The player simply has to approach from the side and hop into the bandages a few times to win. I find it a very strange inclusion, especially considering how little else in the game looks anything like the dragon. A little later on is the encounter with David, which involves using static cannons to shoot the boulder at the sculpture as it circles around. David doesn't really fight back throughout this encounter. He has a cannon in his abdomen, but that really isn't threatening in any way. As his health bar goes down, some catapults and trebuchets appear on the track up to the cannons, but they're no more dangerous than David's pelvis blaster. The cherub fight later on also uses the static cannons to launch the boulder around the arena, but this fight is even less challenging than David. The cherub doesn't visually mesh with the rest of the game at all, and its blowing attack is basically worthless. The arena does more to make hitting the boss difficult than the boss itself. Luckily, all of my criticisms don't apply to the Saturn fight at all. This shit looks like something out of the void. The painting is haunting, and this model is a perfect replication. I think it's the gaping mouth and wide open eyes that really unsettled me the most. Absolutely not what I was expecting the climax of this game to be, but I'm completely on board. Mechanically, the fight is a bit dry. You just climb the spiral and avoid Saturn's attacks, and then do that 3 times to win. Still, the ability to even conceive of these kinds of boss encounters for a game like Rock of Ages shows how special a studio like Ace Team really is, and how worthy of your time their games are. And it doesn't slow down for the sequel at all. The first boss I came across was the Thinker, whose mechanics are utterly bizarre, and yet still somehow reminiscent of platformer bosses. The sculpture slides around the Parisian streets, while occasionally spawning a wave of cannon enemies to attack the player. Sometimes a group of can-can dancers will appear from behind a curtain, which causes the Thinker's brain to burst out of his head, creating an opportunity to attack. Who else makes stuff like this? If there's more out there, I have to know. I do kind of have a nit to pick with this encounter. Mainly that the battle theme doesn't stop playing when the can-can dancers are revealed, so the 2 songs end up fighting for space over each other. And then the Thinker's whistling adds even more noise to the fray. I love how the movie showing off the Thinker's weak spot to the player looks like a Gmod animation. I swear I've seen the G-Man or the Scout make this face before. I know it. There are 2 other bosses before Atlas and God foosball for the fate of the universe or whatever, but they're not quite on the level of the Thinker fight. There's one out in the Celtic Sea, where the player has to frogger across some ships and whales to reach this giant theme park attraction sea serpent. You can fall into the water as much as you want. A tentacle just tosses you back to the nearest platform, which kinda sucks. The serpent shoots a fireball sometimes that can frustratingly kill the balloon in a single hit. Meanwhile, Dies Irae is blasting in the background, like this battle between a beach ball and a kiddie coaster is something truly epic. Conceptually, this is amazing. In practice, I'm not a huge fan. The penultimate boss encounter with the Sphinx is kind of similar to the dragon fight from the first game, but with more humor. The second phase, after Cleopatra puts the lampshade over the Sphinx's head, is great. The bosses are all strange, and often make no sense when put alongside the regular tower defense gameplay. But overall, I think these encounters are definitely worthwhile. Ultimately, the Rock of Ages games are very simple, and they're quite short. But what Ace Team have managed to do with such a limited concept is impressive and commendable. What starts as a boulder rolling down a hill to crush an enemy, veers toward tower defense, racing, and then 3D platforming seamlessly and naturally. And despite the general European art and history theming, the Rock of Ages games still feel distinctly Ace Team's own. The direction and design is fascinating, and I can't recommend the games enough. There really isn't anything like them. This video was supposed to be about Dark Savior, since that was the game you guys voted for in a poll a little while ago. When I sat down to play, I found that my Saturn's internal battery had run out, and the console would no longer keep save data internally, so I had to buy an external memory card. I have it now, so the next video will definitely be the Dark Savior review. I didn't forget!